At 63, he finally reached the top job, Prime Minister of Australia, only to be treated like a punchline. The cameras caught the thin smile, the clipped voice, the restless eyes. And behind that image was a man who had spent almost 3 decades climbing, bargaining, surviving, and who knew, with a cold certainty. However, that time was already running out. William McMahon was born in Sydney on 23 February 1908 into a world that looked stable on the surface and was quietly cracking underneath. His family had money, position, expectations, the kind of household where success wasn't a dream, it was a requirement. But the boy who would one day lead a nation didn't grow up with the easy confidence of someone destined for greatness. He grew up small, careful, watchful. He learned early that in a room full of louder men, you either become invisible or you become indispensable. He went to Sydney Grammar School, then to the University of Sydney. Law was a respectable path, a safe path. Yet even there, the future Prime Minister wasn't the charismatic star. He was the one taking notes, memorizing rules, learning how power actually moved. In the 1920s and early 1930s, Australia was hit by the Great Depression like a physical blow. Jobs vanished, families broke, men lined up for food. And in that atmosphere, politics stopped being an abstract debate and became a brutal argument about survival. McMahon watched it all with the mind of a lawyer. What holds, what collapses, what can be patched together before it tears. He qualified as a solicitor. He built a practice. He looked from the outside like a young professional set for a comfortable life. But comfort wasn't the point. The point was influence. And influence in Australia ran through Parliament. The Second World War arrived like a dark tide. McMahon served in the Australian Army, rising to the rank of major. The war years hardened a generation. They also rearranged the political map. When the guns finally quieted, Australia was different. More anxious, more ambitious, more aware that the world could change overnight. McMahon returned to civilian life with a soldier's sense of urgency. If you wait too long, the moment passes and never comes back. In 1949, he entered the House of Representatives as the Liberal member for Low. It was a good year to be a Liberal. Robert Menzies swept to power, beginning what would become an era. The government benches filled with men who believed they were restoring order after a wartime upheaval. But inside that order, there was a hierarchy as sharp as a blade. Menzies was the towering figure. Brilliant, theatrical, commanding. Around him were ministers with booming voices and big reputations. McMahon, by contrast, was not built for grand speeches. He was built for persistence. He learned the first rule of long political survival: never stop moving. He took on junior roles, then ministerial responsibilities. He became Minister for the Navy, then Minister for Air. These weren't glamorous portfolios, but they mattered in a country still living in the shadow of war and the new fear of the Cold War. Defense wasn't just policy, it was national psychology. McMahon absorbed briefings, mastered details, and made himself useful. Useful men get promoted, useful men get kept. But usefulness has a cost. In Canberra, reputations form like weather systems, slowly, then all at once. McMahon's reputation became that of a man who wanted advancement with a hunger that was almost visible. Colleagues watched him and wondered, is he loyal or is he simply waiting? In politics, that question can follow you like a stain. He moved through portfolios, social services, then primary industry. Each role was another rung on the ladder, another chance to prove competence. Yet the ladder was crowded. The Liberal Party was full of ambitious men, and the Country Party, its coalition partner, had its own demands. Every promotion required negotiation. Every negotiation created enemies. McMahon's skill was that he could smile while counting votes. By the early 1960s, he had become Treasurer of Australia, one of the most powerful positions in government. Money is where politics becomes real. Budgets aren't speeches. They're decisions that hit families, businesses, entire regions. As Treasurer, McMahon had to balance growth, inflation, employment, forces that don't care about party loyalty. He was now in the room where the country's future was argued line by line. And he was close enough to the top to taste it. But the top was guarded by giants. Robert Menzies still dominated. When Menzies finally retired in 1966, the succession didn't fall to McMahon. It went to Harold Holt. Popular, athletic, modern. Holt looked like the future. McMahon looked like the man who had been waiting too long. Still, he stayed. He accepted the role of deputy leader of the Liberal Party and continued as treasurer. He told himself, and anyone who would listen, that patience was strategy. Then history turned savage and surreal. In December 1967, Harold Holt disappeared while swimming at Cheviot Beach. One moment, a prime minister on holiday wading into the surf. The next, a nation staring at empty water. No body recovered, just the image. Waves, rocks, and the sudden, horrifying fact that the leader of the country was simply gone. Australia was thrown into shock, and the Liberal Party into panic. In that chaos, the question of succession became urgent, almost desperate. McMahon saw the opening. He had waited years for a moment like this. But the moment came with a curse. It wasn't a clean transition, it was a national trauma. And even then, the path didn't clear. John McEwen, leader of the Country Party, held the coalition's balance of power. And McEwen made his position brutally clear. If the Liberals chose McMahon as leader, the Country Party would not serve under him. It was a political ultimatum delivered like a knife to the ribs. McMahon, the man who had climbed so carefully, suddenly found himself blocked not by voters, not by the opposition, but by his own side's partner. The reasons were tangled. Policy differences, personal distrust, old resentments. But the effect was simple. McMahon could not become prime minister. Not then, not with McEwen standing in the doorway. So the Liberal Party turned to John Gorton, a senator with war hero credentials and a bold, unpredictable style. Gorton became prime minister in early 1968. McMahon stayed in the ministry, but the humiliation lingered. He had been publicly vetoed. In politics, that kind of wound doesn't heal quietly. It either hardens you or it breaks you. McMahon chose hardening. He shifted to the role of Minister for External Affairs, then later Minister for Foreign Affairs as the portfolio evolved. The world was on fire. Vietnam, Cold War tensions, decolonization, shifting alliances in Asia. Australia's place in the region was being questioned, tested. McMahon traveled, negotiated, represented the country abroad. He built experience that looked on paper like the perfect preparation for leadership. Yet at home, the whispers continued. He was ambitious, yes, but was he respected? And then came the second twist. The enemy wasn't only outside. It was inside the Liberal Party itself. John Gorton's leadership became increasingly contested. His style divided colleagues. Cabinet tensions grew. The government's confidence began to fray. McMahon watched, calculated, waited. He had learned that in politics, you don't always defeat a rival by attacking. Sometimes you simply outlast them. But outlasting has its own deadline. McMahon was no longer a young man. Each year that passed made the dream of the prime ministership feel less like destiny and more like a race against the calendar. In private, he must have felt it. The narrowing window, the fear that he would become the man who almost made it. By 1971, the pressure inside the government reached breaking point. Gorton faced a leadership challenge and survived, barely, then chose to resign. Suddenly, the door that had been slammed in McMahon's face in 1968 creaked open again. The Country Party's John McEwen, the man who had once vetoed him, had stepped down as leader. The old blockade was gone. The moment was back. But it wasn't a triumphal moment. It was tense, suspicious, full of old grudges and new calculations. McMahon had spent years building alliances, smoothing conflicts, proving competence. Now he had to convert all of that into the one thing that mattered: votes in the party room. He won. In March 1971, William McMahon became leader of the Liberal Party and Prime Minister of Australia. And yet, even as he reached the summit, the air was thin and hostile. The country was changing. The opposition leader, Gough Whitlam, was sharpening his message and building momentum. The media was less deferential than it had been in Menzies' day. The public was restless, and McMahon, after decades of waiting, had finally arrived with the clock already ticking loudly in the background. Because the cruel truth about his victory was this: he didn't inherit a golden age. He inherited a government that was tired, divided, and running out of time. And now the man who had spent his life trying to become prime minister had to prove, fast, that he deserved to be there. Before the nation decided he was only ever meant to be the runner-up. The first morning he walked into the prime minister's office, William McMahon didn't step into a throne room. He stepped into a battlefield after the army had already been bleeding for years. The carpet was the same. The flags were the same. The portraits stared down with the same calm authority. But the air had changed. The government was old. The public was impatient. The opposition smelled blood. And McMahon, at 63, had finally seized the prize he'd chased for decades, only to discover it came with a fuse already lit. He had no honeymoon. Not with the press, not with the public, not even with his own side. In Canberra, people didn't just ask whether he could lead. They asked whether he was even meant to. The jokes were immediate and cruel, about his voice, his manner, his nervous energy. The camera loved to catch him mid-blink, mid-grimace, mid-sentence, as if the nation itself was waiting for him to stumble. And the worst part was that McMahon could feel it, the room leaning away from him, the skepticism like a physical weight. He tried to move fast. He reshuffled the ministry, trying to project renewal without detonating the fragile loyalties that had put him there. He spoke of stability, competence, experience, words that sounded reassuring in a quiet decade. But Australia was no longer quiet. The Vietnam War had poisoned trust. Student protests were growing louder. The old deference to authority was cracking. And across the chamber sat Gough Whitlam, tall, confident, theatrical, everything McMahon was not, building the Labour Party into a modern machine that looked like the future arriving early. McMahon's key conflict wasn't a single bill or a single crisis. It was the slow, grinding reality that he had inherited a government in its 23rd year. After that long, even good decisions look like habit. Even honest mistakes look like rot. And every day he stayed in office, the question sharpened. Was he leading or merely holding the door while history pushed through? He tried to seize the initiative with foreign policy, the arena where he believed he could look prime ministerial. The world was shifting under Australia's feet. Britain was turning toward Europe. America was recalibrating in Asia. China, once treated as a distant, hostile monolith, was suddenly being courted by the United States. In 1971, when news broke that Henry Kissinger had secretly visited Beijing, it landed in Canberra like a thunderclap. The global order was rearranging itself behind closed doors, and Australia risked being left outside, pressing its face to the glass. McMahon wanted to show he could act. He announced that Australia would seek to establish relations with the People's Republic of China, but he did it in a way that exposed his vulnerability. Whitlam had already visited China and returned with headlines, photographs, momentum. McMahon's move looked less like leadership and more like a scramble to keep up. In politics, timing is everything. McMahon had spent his life waiting for timing to be right. Now timing was hunting him. At home, the economy was no longer the comfortable engine it had been in the long post-war boom. Inflation was rising, industrial disputes flared. The government's old formulas, steady management, incremental change, felt thin against a society demanding something sharper. McMahon's cabinet was full of experienced men, but experience can curdle into caution. Every decision had to pass through the filter of coalition politics, internal factions, and the constant fear of giving Whitlam a clean target. And Whitlam always found a target. In Parliament, McMahon faced an opponent who could turn a procedural detail into a moral indictment. Whitlam's voice filled the chamber. McMahon's often seemed to vanish into it. The contrast became a story in itself. The tall reformer versus the small, meticulous survivor. McMahon tried to fight on policy, but politics is also theater, and the stage lights were unforgiving. Each time he rose to speak, he wasn't just arguing with Labour. He was arguing with the narrative that he was a stopgap, a man who had arrived too late. Then came the moment that should have been his chance to reset everything. The 1972 election. McMahon chose the timing, and in that choice you can hear the ticking clock in his head. He needed a mandate, something that would turn him from accidental prime minister into elected prime minister. He needed to face the country and win, not merely inherit. But calling an election is like stepping onto a frozen lake. You can't know where the cracks are until you're already out there. The campaign was brutal. Labour ran on "It's time," a slogan that wasn't just marketing, it was a verdict. It implied the government had overstayed, that the nation had been forced to wait while the Liberals and their coalition partners clung to power out of habit. McMahon tried to counter with warnings about economic risk, about radical change, about inexperience. Yet the more he warned, the more he sounded like the past, pleading for one more year. He also carried the burden of internal doubt. Even within his own party, there were those who never fully believed in him. Some had preferred Gorton. Some had preferred someone else entirely. Some simply resented the way McMahon had climbed. Patiently, relentlessly, always there, always maneuvering. Leadership challenges had scarred the Liberal Party for years, and McMahon was the product of those scars. He could feel the loyalty around him, but he could also feel how conditional it was, how quickly it could evaporate if the polls turned colder. And the polls did turn colder. Whitlam's Labour looked disciplined, modern, hungry. McMahon's government looked tired, defensive, divided by the very coalition arithmetic that had kept it alive. The country party had its own priorities, its own constituencies, its own red lines. Every time McMahon tried to pivot, he had to check whether the pivot would snap the coalition in half. He was prime minister, but he was also a man constantly counting numbers. Inside cabinet, inside the party room, inside the electorate. On election night, 2nd December 1972, the long Liberal era ended. After 23 years, the coalition lost. Whitlam won. The country didn't just change government, it changed mood. The result felt like a door slamming shut on an entire style of politics. For McMahon, it was the most personal kind of defeat, the defeat that arrives right after you finally get what you wanted. He had waited decades for the prime ministership, and he held it for less than 2 years. In the harsh arithmetic of history, his time at the top looked like a footnote. But in the raw reality of the moment, it was worse than a footnote. It was a public confirmation of the fear that had haunted him, that he would be remembered not for the climb, but for the fall. He didn't leave quietly. He became leader of the opposition, facing Whitlam across the chamber, now in the role he had spent his life trying to escape. The man on the other side, the man saying no. It was a strange reversal. Whitlam, once the challenger, now commanded the machinery of government with a speed that shocked even his supporters. McMahon watched as labor moved rapidly. Recognition of China, withdrawal from Vietnam, sweeping reforms. Actions that made the old government look even more cautious in retrospect. But McMahon's opposition leadership was haunted by the same problem as his prime ministership. Perception. He was not a natural performer. He was not a natural symbol. And the Liberal Party, freshly defeated, began to look for a new face, a new voice, a new weapon. The pressure built quickly. In early 1973, the party turned to Billy Snedden. McMahon was replaced as leader. In less than 12 months, he had gone from prime minister to former prime minister to backbencher, an astonishing compression of status, like watching a building collapse floor by floor. And yet, even then, he didn't vanish. He stayed in Parliament. He sat through question times, committee meetings, the daily grind. The man who had survived for decades did what he always did. He endured. But endurance without power is a different kind of test. It's quieter, lonelier. It forces you to listen to how people talk about you when you can no longer shape the conversation. McMahon's time limit had always been age, the calendar, the narrowing window. Now the limit was something else: relevance. In politics, yesterday's leader can become today's inconvenience with terrifying speed. He had to decide whether to fight for a return, to plot another climb, or to accept that the summit had been a brief, wind-battered place he would never stand on again. He chose, at least publicly, to accept it. He remained a member for Lowe, a presence in the Liberal Party, a man with memories of cabinet rooms and crisis calls. But the story had turned. Australia was entering a new era, and McMahon, who had spent his life trying to arrive at the right moment, found himself watching the moment move on without him, as if history had finally stopped waiting. The first weeks after losing office were not a dignified fade-out. They were a harsh, fluorescent come-down, like stepping from the glare of the Prime Minister's car into a corridor where nobody turns their head. McMahon had spent his life climbing toward one door, and now every door in Parliament House seemed to open for someone else. The cameras that once hunted his face now drifted past him, searching for the new drama. And the cruelest contrast was this. The man who had waited decades for power now had more time than he knew what to do with, and almost no power at all. He tried to turn that time into a weapon. As leader of the opposition, he faced Gough Whitlam not as a rival for the future, but as a threat in the present. Whitlam's government moved with a speed that felt almost reckless, recognizing the People's Republic of China, ending conscription, accelerating withdrawal from Vietnam, pushing reforms through with the confidence of a party that believed history had finally handed it the keys. For McMahon, it was like watching someone else drive the car he'd spent his whole life polishing. Every bold announcement from Labor didn't just change policy, it rewrote the story of the previous government as timid and exhausted. And McMahon understood something terrifying. He wasn't only fighting Whitlam, he was fighting the way the country was beginning to remember him. In Parliament, the contrast became theater. Whitlam was tall, booming, expansive. He filled the chamber like a man born for it. McMahon was quick, meticulous, sometimes sharp, sometimes brittle, always aware of how he looked and sounded. He tried to land blows on competence, on cost, on process. He attacked what he could attack: the speed, the spending, the improvisation. But Whitlam's momentum was a tide, and McMahon's words often felt like stones thrown into surf. Brief splashes swallowed instantly. Behind the scenes, the Liberal Party was already shifting under his feet. Defeat had opened old wounds. The party wanted renewal, and renewal rarely comes with the face of the man who just lost. McMahon could feel the impatience in the party room, the glances that didn't quite meet his eyes, the conversations that stopped when he entered, the subtle arithmetic of numbers being counted. He had lived by numbers his entire career, votes in caucus, seats in cabinet, margins in electorates, and now the numbers were turning against him again. The time limit was brutal and immediate. He had to prove he could hurt Whitlam before his own side decided he was the wrong weapon. And in politics, when your colleagues start thinking of you as a weapon, it means they're already imagining replacing you. He tried to sharpen his edge. He pressed on inflation and industrial unrest. He questioned the rapid expansion of government programs. He warned that the new administration was moving too fast, spending too freely, trusting too much in good intentions. Yet the country, still intoxicated by change, didn't want caution. It wanted transformation. And every time McMahon sounded the alarm, Labor framed it as the old order panicking. Then came the internal coup, swift and unsentimental. In April 1973, the Liberal Party replaced him with Billy Snedden. The fall was almost physically shocking. In less than a year, McMahon had gone from prime minister to opposition leader to ordinary member. It was as if the political world had decided to compress his entire peak into a single, sharp bruise. But McMahon did not leave. He stayed on the backbench, still the member for Low, still turning up, still reading briefs, still watching the chamber like a man who refuses to stop listening for his name. And here in the quieter grind, another conflict began. Less visible than elections and leadership spills, but more personal. McMahon had to live inside a parliament that treated former prime ministers like yesterday's newspaper. Still technically there, but already folded and set aside. He looked for relevance where he could find it. He spoke on economic management, on foreign affairs, on the machinery of government. He had been treasurer for years. He knew budgets like anatomy. He had been foreign minister. He understood the cold logic of alliances. Yet expertise is not the same as authority. In the new era, the Liberal Party's center of gravity moved away from him. The party was searching for a different kind of leader, someone who could match Whitlam's scale, his confidence, his modernity. And Whitlam, for all his brilliance, began to generate his own storms. The early 1970s were not gentle years. The global economy was shifting. Inflation and oil shocks were beginning to bite. Industrial disputes flared. Government spending rose. Administrative mistakes multiplied under the pressure of rapid reform. Whitlam's opponents began to smell vulnerability. McMahon watched it all with a complicated mix of vindication and frustration. Vindication because some of his warnings seemed to be coming true, frustration because he was no longer the one holding the microphone. The Liberal Party's leadership changed again. Snedden gave way to Malcolm Fraser in 1975, a harder, more forceful figure, built for confrontation. McMahon, now further from the center, became a witness to a new kind of opposition. Aggressive, disciplined, willing to push the system to its limits. And the system, in 1975, would be pushed to a place Australia had never seen. The constitutional crisis did not belong to McMahon, but it unfolded in the parliament he still inhabited, like a fire spreading through familiar rooms. The Senate blocked supply. The government's ability to fund itself became a weapon. The country held its breath as the machinery of democracy jammed and screamed. And then on 11 November 1975, Governor-General Sir John Kerr dismissed Whitlam. The Prime Minister, McMahon's old rival, the man who had ended the long Liberal era, was suddenly out not by election, but by an extraordinary act of vice-regal power. Canberra that day was a scene of raw electricity. Crowds, shouting, disbelief. Whitlam's words, "Well, may we say, God save the Queen?" rang like a curse and a rallying cry. McMahon, inside this storm, was not the protagonist. But he was a man who understood how fragile power really was, and how quickly it could be taken. He had lost office at the ballot box. Whitlam had lost it in a single, stunning decision. The contrast was almost grotesque. McMahon's slow defeat versus Whitlam's sudden decapitation. Fraser won the subsequent election in a landslide. The Liberals returned, not as tired incumbents but as avengers of chaos. And McMahon, still in Parliament, watched his party regain the heights he had briefly occupied. It might have been his chance to re-enter the inner circle, Former prime ministers sometimes become elder statesmen, advisors, respected voices. But McMahon's relationship with his own party had always been complicated. He had been a relentless climber, and climbers leave scratches. Many colleagues remembered the maneuvers, the patience that looked like plotting, the ambition that never slept. In the Fraser era, McMahon was not brought back as a central figure. He remained again on the edge, yet he kept working, he kept speaking, he kept showing up. There is a particular kind of stubbornness in that, an insistence that your story is not finished just because the spotlight moved. He served on committees, contributed to debates, and maintained his electorate working low. The public image of him, nervous, fussy, unlucky, never fully lifted. But inside Parliament, he was still a man with decades of institutional memory, someone who had seen governments rise and collapse, alliances shift, leaders devour each other. And then, in 1982, another turn, Fraser lost to Bob Hawke, and the Liberals went back into opposition. McMahon was now an old man in a younger political world. The country had changed again. More media, more speed, more polish. Politics was becoming a performance with sharper editing. McMahon, who had always struggled with the camera, now lived in an era where the camera was everything. He faced a new time limit, quieter but absolute, the end of his parliamentary life. He had entered federal politics in 1949. By the early 1980s, he had been there longer than many voters had been alive. The question was no longer whether he could return to power. It was whether he could leave on his own terms. In 1982, he was knighted, Sir William McMahon. The title sounded like a reward, but it also sounded like a closing bracket, a formal way of saying, your era is over. He continued as an MP until 1982 and then stepped away, ending one of the longest parliamentary careers in Australian history. When he finally left the chamber, it wasn't with a roar. It was with the soft scrape of a chair pushed back, the quiet departure of a man who had spent almost his entire adult life inside that building. Outside Parliament, the world did not slow down to accommodate his memories. He wrote, he spoke occasionally, he watched politics from the sidelines. His marriage to Sonia McMahon, glamorous, complicated, often scrutinized, remained part of his public shadow. Sonia had been a striking presence during his prime ministership, sometimes more photographed than he was, a reminder that public attention does not always follow formal power. Their relationship, like much of McMahon's life, was lived under observation, judged in fragments, and the judgments kept coming. Historians and journalists often ranked him harshly. The jokes about his voice and manner lingered long after his policies were forgotten. His prime ministership was frequently described as a brief interlude between bigger figures, John Gorton's Turbulence and Whitlam's Revolution. That was the final cruelty. McMahon had fought his whole life not to be a footnote, and yet the popular story kept trying to compress him into one. But if you look closely, his career refuses to be that simple. He was not a man who appeared out of nowhere and vanished. He was a product of the post-war liberal machine. Disciplined, persistent, obsessed with detail, capable of surviving storms that would have ended other careers. He held major portfolios for years. He helped steer economic policy through long stretches of stability. He navigated foreign affairs in a period when Australia's old certainties about Britain, about Asia, about America were being rewritten. Even his failure tells a truth, that ambition can be patient and still be punished by timing. In his final years, illness began to narrow his world. The body that had carried him through decades of late nights, cabinet battles, and parliamentary marathons started to fail. The clock that had always been ticking in his head, first toward leadership, then toward relevance, became a literal clock. On 31st March 1988, William McMahon died at 79. And here is the last unsettling contrast that makes his story linger. He achieved the highest office in the country, but the office did not grant him the kind of authority that lives forever in the national imagination. He reached the summit, but the weather was against him. The ground was already shifting, and the crowd was already looking past him to the next peak. Yet the climb itself, decade after decade, portfolio after portfolio, leadership contest after leadership contest, reveals something raw about politics. Not the glamorous version, not the heroic version, but the real one. A world where endurance can be both your greatest strength and your quietest tragedy. McMahon's life is the story of a man who refused to stop moving, even when history kept trying to move on without him. Imagine spending 20 years clawing your way to the very top, only to discover that the summit is not a throne, but a trap door. One day you're prime minister, so nascenis sharitura de binwari. The next you're a punchline. And the most brutal part? You don't get to argue with the joke. It gets told without you, repeated without you, and it keeps getting funnier to everyone else as you get older. After he left Parliament, William McMahon entered the most dangerous phase of his life. The part where there are no votes to win, no cabinet papers to master, no rivals to outmaneuver in a party room, just memory. And memory for a politician is a courtroom with no appeal. He tried to seize control of the narrative the way he'd always seized control of a brief, by working harder than anyone, by outlasting the discomfort, by refusing to disappear. But the 1980s were not kind to men from the old Canberra. Australia was changing its voice, its confidence, its idea of leadership. Television had become sharper, faster, more merciless. The country wanted big characters and clean stories. McMahon's story was neither. It was complicated, technical, full of narrow escapes and long waits. And it ended in the public mind with a short prime ministership. That looked like an accident of timing. So he did what he had always done when cornered. He kept moving. He wrote, he gave interviews. He stayed close enough to politics to feel its heat, but far enough away to be unable to shape it. And in that distance, a new conflict took over, one he couldn't solve with numbers or procedure. It was the conflict between the man he believed he had been and the man Australia had decided to remember. The image that followed him was stubborn. The anxious voice, the fussy manner, the sense of a leader who never quite filled the room. It didn't matter that he had been treasurer for years, that he had been foreign minister, that he had sat at the center of government. Longer than most of his critics had been adults. The public story had simplified him into a brief intermission between louder, more cinematic figures. In politics, being underestimated can be useful. In retirement, it becomes a sentence. And then there was Sonia. If William McMahon struggled with the camera, Sonia McMahon seemed built for it. She had been a striking, glamorous presence during his time in office. Photographed constantly, discussed endlessly, sometimes treated as a celebrity in her own right. In an era when political spouses were expected to be discreet, she was vivid. And that vividness, which had once brought attention to the McMahon household, also fed a cruel contrast. People remembered her outfits, her poise, her public magnetism, while forgetting his policies, his cabinet battles, his long apprenticeship. Their marriage, always under scrutiny, did not become simpler with age. The spotlight didn't vanish, it just changed angle. The press that once chased them for glamour now watched for fracture. And for William, who had spent his life trying to control outcomes, that was a special kind of torment, the most intimate part of. His public identity was something he could never fully command. He had been knighted Sir William McMahon, an honor that sounded grand but also final, like a plaque being screwed onto a door that was already closing. Titles can be a reward, but they can also be a way of filing someone away. The system he had served for decades was, politely, putting him in the past. Still, he refused to accept the role of museum piece. He wanted to be taken seriously as a witness to history, not a footnote in it. He had lived through the transformation of Australia's relationship with Britain, the tightening embrace of the American alliance, the long post-war boom, the shocks of the 1970s, the constitutional crisis that tore at the country's nerves. He had sat in rooms where decisions were made that never reached the public in full. He knew how government really worked, how much of it was improvisation, how much was ego, how much was fear disguised as principle. But the problem with being a witness is that people only listen if they already want your version of events. And McMahon's version was always fighting uphill. Even sympathetic observers struggled to make him heroic. His strengths, persistence, detail, endurance were not the kind that make legends. They were the kind that make governments function. And functional is rarely remembered with affection. In those years, the judgments hardened. Rankings of prime ministers placed him near the bottom. Old jokes were recycled as if they were analysis. His brief time in the top job was described as a weak bridge between eras, a caretaker period before the Whitlam Revolution. It was a brutal irony. He had waited so long to become prime minister that, by the time he got there, history was already impatient for the next act. And yet, if you look at the raw facts of his life, the simplification feels almost obscene. He had entered federal parliament in 1949 and stayed for more than 3 decades. He had held senior portfolios for years, Treasury, External Affairs, positions that shape a nation's direction, even when the public can't name the minister. He had been at the center of the Liberal Party's internal wars, surviving leadership tensions that would have ended less disciplined men. He had been, in the most literal sense, one of the most experienced politicians Australia ever produced. But experience is not the same as myth. And McMahon, in retirement, was learning that myth is what survives. Then the clock began to tighten. In his final years, illness narrowed his world. The body that had carried him through late-night cabinet meetings and endless parliamentary sessions began to fail, turning his famous endurance into something more fragile. The time limit that had once been political, prove yourself before the party replaces you, strike before the election arrives, became biological. No maneuver could delay it. No speech could outpace it. No amount of willpower could negotiate with it. For a man who had spent his life believing that persistence could solve almost anything, this was the one opponent he could not wear down. On 31st March 1988, William McMahon died at 79. Death for public figures is often followed by a sudden softening, an agreement to be respectful, to speak gently, to let the sharp edges blur. But even that mercy was limited for McMahon. The country did not suddenly reframe him as a giant. The old assessments remained. The old contrasts remained. He was still the man who reached the summit too late, held it too briefly, and was remembered too narrowly. And yet there is a final twist in his story, one that only becomes clear when you stop looking for a heroic arc and start looking for a human one. McMahon's life is not the story of a natural leader who rose effortlessly. It's the story of a man who refused to stop climbing even when the climb itself was costing him. He was not gifted with Whitlam's grandeur or Fraser's force or Hawke's ease. He had to build his career out of discipline, calculation, and sheer stubborn survival. He endured ridicule. He endured internal hostility. He endured the slow, grinding reality that in politics, your allies can be more dangerous than your enemies because they know exactly where you're vulnerable. And he kept going anyway. That persistence can look unromantic, even pathetic, if you only measure it by the length of his prime ministership. But measured across a lifetime, it becomes something else. A portrait of ambition that never sleeps. Of a man who believed that if he just held on long enough, history would have to make room for him. History did make room. It just didn't give him the kind of room he wanted. So when you picture William McMahon at the end, don't picture the caricature. Picture the older man who had once been at the center of everything, now watching the country move on without him, still alert, still restless, still trying to correct the record in his head. A man who reached the highest office and discovered that the office cannot guarantee greatness, cannot guarantee affection, cannot even guarantee fair memory. And that is why his story lingers. Because it's not only about politics, it's about the terrifying possibility that you can devote your entire life to one goal, achieve it, and still lose the argument about who you were